Welcome back to Strength Within. Today's podcast is a little bit different in that the person that I'm interviewing isn't a serving member or an ex serving member. She has never served, but she has a really, really informed take and professional experience in the defense sphere. I won't get into too much of her background. I'll let her speak for herself. But a key thing that she works around is identity in defense and how identity in defense is a good thing and a bad thing and how it can shape our experiences. So, without further ado, my first guest is Carolyn Heward. She's a clinical psychologist and an academic. Over to you, Carolyn. Carolyn, thank you so much for your time in coming to chat with us at Strength Within. I was wondering if you could please just give us a brief summary of who you are and how you got involved in this veterans health kind of space.
Absolutely. So I'm a clinical psychologist. Essentially, just about all of my professional work has been with the Defence Force. So I've been in a variety of roles. I started as a rehab consultant. I also have worked previously for the Department of Defence in the regional mental health team. And I've also been a contractor on base providing psychological services to both current serving members, command, I suppose, as well. And I've also worked, I guess, in private practice, so working with ex-serving members. So clinically, my area of interest is working with the Defence Force. The other side, I suppose I will add, is that I am a lecturer at university and I'm currently undertaking my PhD exploring identity construction in the army. So it's an area that just fascinates me and, gets me out of bed each morning. That probably sounds a bit silly, but essentially it excites me. This is an area I enjoy talking about. It's an area I enjoy working within. So yeah, happy to speak to that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And that's really why I wanted to involve you in this, because as you and I have spoken about, for the most part, I'm interviewing members and ex-members quite intentionally. And initially I said what I don't want is psychs interviewing psychs, because God love my psych colleagues. They all were like, I want to share my experience. And I was like, that's great, but our experiences are so similar in terms of as previous serving psychs. But I was really keen to get you involved in part, actually, because I'm really passionate about helping people to realize that you don't need to have served to be an incredible asset to the defense community, and that sometimes having not served, but having an incredible understanding of the culture lets you ask questions that we don't think to ask. And you and I have worked together in the past, and I'd be the first to say that's true of me, is that sometimes in meetings I would say something as though it were fact, honestly, and then you would go, actually, what about this? And I would realize, oh my God, I'm so entrenched in the machine that I don't see it. And so I'm like, I think that I fully understand why people go, there's a bit of an idea of like, oh, you can't treat PTSD if you haven't been in combat, which we know doesn't work for so many reasons. And it's fascinating because, like, if I'm having surgery, I don't go, oh, well, has my surgeon had the same surgery I've had? Because that's otherwise, how can he possibly know? And it's like, but we do that with mental health. And then we take it even further and we get sometimes a little bit of a stigma around, oh, I need the person who've had this or this experience. I'm like, yeah, actually, sometimes what's interesting is that often uniformed psychs have actually had less clinical experience than civilian psychs. I would say it's not unfair to say that's true most of the time, just due to the nature of the work. But they maybe get more credibility, whereas I'm like, there's a lot of credibility in the civilian workforce in that space, in the research space. And I've read some of your research that you've done, and I'm always struck by how much you get it, how much you get the culture. Like, if I didn't know you, I would assume you had served. And so I think that speaks to the fact that no, there's a lot of ways that we can come at this. And so that's why I was really keen to get you involved. I deliberately didn't introduce you as a PhD candidate because I was like, I don't know if that's like offensive or not. Like, I was like, I don't have a PhD. So to me, I'm like, that's amazing. You're doing a PhD kind of thing. But I was like, oh, do we not talk about it until it's done? I don't know how that works.
I don't know that there's a superstition around PhD like there are sort of other things, sporting environments and the like. Don't talk about it until it's done. No, certainly I'm happy to acknowledge that. And I really appreciate you bringing that up because about my being a civilian is that something I'm always very conscious of whenever I'm working with defence members is I never want to misrepresent myself as having served. And so I think that that is an important space. But the other point you raised that I wanted to speak to is something we certainly talk about when we're training our psychologists is that acknowledgement that sometimes having lived experience can mean that we assume we understand something when we actually don't. And so someone who seems quite different to us, we actually tend to be more culturally appropriate because we're more likely to be curious. I don't know about that. Can you tell me about that? Whereas if we've had that experience, we could be, and so we're certainly not always, but we could be more inclined to be like, oh, yes, I know what you mean because I've also had that experience. And sometimes that is valid, but sometimes it's not because we make our own assumptions, which might not mirror, in this case, the individual member's experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It stands out to me at times when I've worked in the health centers and we'll have, say, a new intern psychologist who will come in and they'll be a lieutenant, right? And when the intake teams are trying to allocate people, it will always be this member would really like a uniformed person and they have complex PTSD. And you're like, so do they want a uniformed person? Which I can provide, but that person actually is under supervision and has been in uniform 2 weeks and cannot do that treatment. Or can I give you someone who's treated combat PTSD for 20 years, but yeah, she wears beads and a big skirt. Like, and it's, and you know, I say that flippantly, but I get where members are coming from because again, obviously having been a member and I see the two sides of it, which is that I think there are truly times when members, if you explain it that way, they'd rather see a civilian. I think there's times when members would rather see a civilian because there's no chance that that person goes to the mess with their boss. And I think there are really valid times when you can't undersell how important that understanding of the culture is. But sometimes we get mixed up between understanding the culture and being in uniform, and those are actually two different things.
I agree completely. And similarly, I've seen that. I think that anyone who's working with the Defence Force, and this is obviously a big area of interest and importance to me in my research, but anyone who's working with the Defence Force does have a responsibility to, as best as possible, be curious and seek to understand, appreciate that there is a whole language that comes with working with defence members, that understanding the rules, the expectations, the values, that we can certainly as civilian psychologists make an awful lot of errors if we just assume a defence member is like any other client. I don't believe that's true for a second. So we have a responsibility to ensure that we are being essentially culturally responsive in this space.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they've just changed the APS code of ethics around like what is being culturally competent. And I often think about this space, and I'm very passionate about that in terms of ethnicity and faith, and that is something I'm very interested in. But I do often think about it in this context where I go, and when I've been in those managerial positions, that's I take that really seriously. Like if I'm managing a team of psychs who don't know the culture, it's my job to try to impart it. But I think it can be lost sometimes. I remember I had a client, this is years and years ago when I was still serving, and he'd come back to me to seek help, even though he didn't want to be seen internally, but he'd gone through somewhere else, an external provider, and that just by sheer luck, that external provider, because of the location we were in, predominantly saw Air Force members. And
Mm.
then this member has turned up and is, you know, an Army person of a certain rank. And in the Air Force, normally that rank does certain things. And so then the clinician has, thinking they're being like sort of culturally considered, has started talking about stuff and really pissed this guy off because I mean, if you want to make an infantry guy angry, like act like he's in the Air Force, right? Like I learned a valuable lesson that day. But I think it is interesting of that where we can come unstuck is when we make assumptions. And that's true across therapy in general, which is we shouldn't make assumptions about someone's experience. But can you like explain a little bit about what your research is in there? Something that you and I have talked about before is the idea of like, I don't think your title involves hegemonic masculinity, but it's definitely part of it. Those are very big, strange words. Can you explain to me, like I'm five, what hegemonic masculinity means?
Absolutely.
Sorry, and I know I'm now going to throw you off, but there's a part of me that's like, explain to me like I'm five, and then I'm like, actually, that's probably gives myself more credit. Like, maybe just explain to me like I'm Aleesha.
No, I think it's valid, and actually, it's probably quite appropriate to reference a 5-year-old because an awful lot of it starts when boys are quite young, and so it's this idea that there is a rule book, there is a correct way that men are meant to behave, or to be masculine is to look a certain way. And that is often about, that is about strength, that is about dominance and the like. And so essentially when we think about it, a hegemonic masculinity, we're talking about this rule book that says this is what being masculine looks like. And we really don't accept anything outside of that space. And so anyone that doesn't live up to that ideal is considered somehow lesser. And sometimes that can even be to the extent of being considered weak. And that can apply to both men, but certainly it also applies to women serving in a military organization that has very sort of strong masculine ideals about the correct way to be a defense member. So, yeah, I kind of think about it as in it's this rule book around how men or people within traditionally masculine roles are meant to behave, how they're meant to be, how they're meant to feel, or importantly, not feel, if we're talking about some of the softer emotions. And so that's a space that can leave people feeling bad if they don't measure up.
I think it's a really interesting space, and I guess, like, my views on it probably shifted over time, as I think is true as we age. And you can look back, and I can really look back at being a young female in the and that was like, I joined 17 years ago. So I like to say, like, I was pretty once. I was a hot young female. I'm not saying I'm hot now. I was a hot young female, right? And I remember, without being conscious of it, the way to survive, right? The way to survive is to be just enough one of the boys that you don't draw too much attention to yourself, but you also still have to, like, and be fuckable as well, is the reality. Whether you are straight, gay, whatever, you have to be like the ideal of hot enough, but not distractingly hot. And that was all subconscious of, like, how do I fit this role? And it's exhausting, right? And I can only imagine then how exhausting it is for people who, like, for me, it was kind of like, I'm pretty extroverted, whatever, like, some of that doesn't go against my values, but for some people, they're not going to be able to kind of play that game. And then when you think about men who have this increased pressure in a different way, especially in that organization, of then what is it if you are a man who is not strong, who is not going to talk about all the women he's slept with, who is not, and something where I think why people are reluctant to talk about this in any defense space is this idea of, you're talking about making people, like, weak, or, like, you're saying it's bad to be weak. Well, it is bad to be weak, right? Like, that's the organizational view. And it's like, actually, what we're talking about is our conceptualization of strength and weakness, like, tied
Absolutely.
into something it doesn't need to be tied into.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess, it's one of the areas that the research also supports. So I can hear about, your lived experience and the things that you've observed in serving, but the research also talks to that. And so essentially for women, we hear these themes of this sense of never being considered good enough. But in order to prove oneself, you've also got to work twice as hard. So you've got to perform higher than to be considered even half as good. And I guess the further element is that societally, this sort of idea that women aren't considered to be defense members, they aren't considered to be veterans. And so there's certainly been media reports, and I know I've heard from clients as well and from friends about experiences on Anzac Day, for example, being challenged about wearing their own medals that they have earned, that they're wearing them on the wrong side of their chest because there's this assumption that they couldn't be theirs. And so that's horrifying as far as valuing someone's service and undermining it purely because of their gender. And so that's an area, obviously, I get quite passionate about. But more broadly, I guess, is the point you made, though, is also the way it does impact on men. This idea that you've got to compartmentalize any element of yourself that might be perceived as, and I keep using that term, but weak, that doesn't measure up. And I guess the only other thing I would say about that is the area where I see this often comes to the front is when people are injured. When people are injured, when people are downgraded and they can't do their job, regardless of what their job may be, that the impacts that happen to that sense of identity of fitting into this organization, when you cannot do your job, when your restrictions mean you might not be able to take part in PT, you can't deploy, you can't be promoted. There's so many elements that come with that again send that very strong message that you don't measure up. You are not meeting our requirements. You don't measure up. And some people navigate that just fine. But we obviously, and clinically, I've seen a lot of members where the physical injury, because often that's what we're talking about, becomes a psychological injury because of that insult to the identity and essentially these masculine rules around what it means to be a member.
And I think it's really interesting too, of, like, physical injury, psychological injury, but also even this approach and this mindset can make the physical injuries worse, because when we talk about those kind of like masculine ideals, one of them is that you push through pain and that you push through injury and that even if you're hurt, you keep going. And the challenge is, of course, that like when we're talking about I'm in a firefight and I've got shot and I need to keep moving. Yes, of course. But I feel like I get passionate in this space too. I mean, in the same way, like I agree with everything you're saying, but in a different space, which is that when people try to reduce it to we need people who can push through, I'm like, yeah, but what we need is, and I would say we have it, is people smart enough to know when is the time to push and when is it okay. And I would say that, you know what? An injury that you get in November and C series isn't until the next year, maybe take the time to recover. But we've inadvertently created a culture where people like, and it's some of it is that masculine thing, some of it is that there are obviously, mech implications and whatnot. But I'm like, people are so scared of their mech changing, whereas it's like, if your mech changes and you fix it and then you come back stronger, that's a positive thing. And most commanders actually get this now because historically the challenge has been commanders pushing people like to upgrade for the most part now, I think that they're like, what I want is for you to be good in a year and remain good for 3 years. I don't want you good in 2 weeks. And when I say for the most part, I'm like, I've seen commanders like do that poorly within the last 2 years, but I think the majority of people are getting it. But it's fascinating because whenever you try to have this discussion, people go to like, you're trying to make the force weaker. And I'm like, no, no, no. I very much value what the ADF does. I'm trying to make the force stronger long term, is what I'm trying to do. Like, I'm actually not saying let's all sit around and play kumbaya, but that's what people interpret it as. And it's like, no, like, just think it's interesting if we don't, if no one's willing to have the discussion, how do you move forward with it?
Look, absolutely. I think the culture of the ADF is absolutely changing. We're seeing an evolution in the works, but I agree with you that there are still some of those hangovers. And that's not always members who have been in for longer. It's not always the crusty old warrant officer who's like, back in my day. I've met members who have only been in for a few years and they talk about back in my day, it was harder. When I went through Kapuka, when I went through my IETs, it was much tougher. These kids these days. And it's this really interesting element. And I know we see that in the civvy space across generations as well, that idea that the previous generation had it harder than the current generation. But it's curious that sometimes those generational elements in defence can seem more compressed. And so, yeah, I do want to acknowledge that I do think there's a change. But I agree with you about that sort of narrative around the implications of your mech changing, of it becoming a, restricted category where you're not able to provide full service. That sense of what that then means as an individual. There is a culture that surrounds that, and an element of it is that hegemonic masculinity. It is more than that, of course, but that culture is something that still needs further evolution to find the balance between, yes, we need war fighters. We're not going to sit around the campfire. But at the same time, I really loved what you said, that idea of this is about the longevity of the Defence Force, of someone's service, as opposed to focusing on this sort of quick turnaround, that idea of they've pushed through, so therefore they've proven that they're strong.
I see that even, and I have permission from my spouse to talk about him. I see that even in him, which is that when he's an infantry officer, and when he did his ROBC, he broke his ankle on his ROBC. And if you are removed from the field phase of ROBC, that's it. You don't pass, which is correct. That's how it should be, right? And so we're living in Darwin, young family. He's in Singleton, and he's a young bloke. And what does he do? He goes, "Well, I don't want to have to do this twice. I'll just strap this ankle to hell." And he tells the medics, just give me whatever medication you're allowed to give me that doesn't mean I have to go back. And they do it because they're like, well, it's his pain. And then, pushes through, pushes through, pushes through. At some point, gets an X-ray because, gosh, his ankle and his knee and his back hurt. And subsequently, where you've ended up with, and that's not his only injury because we know the infantry is not great on your body, but you can really draw a direct line to had we had some sort of middle ground, he wouldn't be as injured now because of that. And that's the story I can use, right? But I'm like, that's one of thousands of stories, really.
Look, absolutely. I think the examples we've heard of individuals who get injured while they're in basic training and, the horror of being back squatted and so push through. And then that carries into, say, their IETs. But it's also, once you get to the unit, that can be gripped up more, etc. And so can you just manage it until that point? And so we get an injury, and sometimes they're not as extreme as a broken bone, but they're injuries that without the appropriate early conservative management become a much bigger deal. And so there are elements around individuals who are likely attracted to the Defence Force that are likely to be the sort that are going to more readily want to push through and prove themselves. So it's not to imply it is only the culture of the Defence Force. There is an individual component. But the issue is that you see then these potential for this longer term impact, and whether that be longer term impact because now that injury, shin splints, for example, that could have been rehabilitated within a, say, 6-week period, but then progress to much more complex injuries and affect the body much more. And I'll stay in my lane because I am not not a physio, not an exophysiologist, but essentially that way in which something that is a physical injury can become so much more complicated. And then, as we've touched on, the interrelationship with then the mental health space, and whether that be a diagnosis or whether that just be the negative mental health impacts of this sense that I can't do what I believe I should be able to do, what the organisation believes I should be able to do. And yes, there is change happening, but it's still got a way to go, I guess would be my thought.
Yeah, and I think the change when I see it relies on specific individuals. Like I'm thinking of I won't embarrass him, but I'm thinking of a CEO I saw like semi recently speaking to a member and sort of saying a version of what I said, which was, mate, we're not being nice to you by saying it's fine for this to be like this. We're saying in 2 years we're going to do this task and I want you on it. So let's get this sorted. But there's no, and I think this is not an unfair thing to say about army, especially across the board. They rely on leaders who are just naturally good leaders, and the leadership training continuum actually doesn't, like, until you get much higher up, it doesn't talk about things like reflection and how confirmation bias works and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's progress there too. But there was something else I was going to say just in terms of what we're saying. Oh, that was it. Just I think you made a really good point around. You're right that some of this is that we want people who have the trait of pushing through, and we don't want to remove that trait at all. Like that's such an important thing. And I would say I'm one of these people. And then you're like, and I know the really good parts of that. I know the really bad parts of that. But we just need to make sure that we're setting an environment where they know when is it time to push and when isn't it. Because I think across the board, what you see, and you see this in all environments in defense, is this idea of, oh, well, they have to be able to be sworn at because in a contact, I can't watch my language. And it's like, yeah, I completely agree. I think it can't be that someone is so sensitive they can never be sworn at. Equally, I don't think the best way to have a hard conversation with someone about messing up something admin is to scream in their face. Like, and even just from from a physiological perspective, which psychs we get straight away, which is actually the minute you scream like that, you've shut down the part of their brain that they can learn. So, like, you're not even achieving what you want to achieve. But it's interesting, and I guess it takes it into that sort of transitiony space, is that then some of these things they're not the norm in, like, quote unquote, the real world. And then it can be so jarring for people. I mean, I remember when I first left, I was running late to work, which, as you know now know me, is quite common, but at the time wasn't common. I used to be on time. And I texted a colleague, it was Andy, who you know, and I was like, hey, I'm so sorry I'm 5 minutes late. Can you just, make my apologies or whatever? And I got there, and he's, as you know, he's a very kind, considerate guy. And he was like, oh, is everything all good? I was like, yeah. And he goes, you don't have to do that. Like, don't do that again. Like, it's fine. People are 5 minutes late. It's not the end of the world. But to me, it was the end of the world. I was freaking out. I was like, I'm going to be in so much trouble. And I couldn't even have, if I reflected on it, I was unable to say who I thought I would be in trouble from or what that trouble would entail. But your mindset becomes completely shifted as to what is a big deal, what isn't a big deal, what is acceptable. So I guess in that space, what do you see as those kind of challenges that people face when they leave?
I think that that can be so broad, can't it? Like It depends on why someone's leaving. Like, I do think that that's a big component, and I know you appreciate that. But of course, if someone's leaving by choice as opposed to they're being medically separated, and are they being medically separated because they've already chosen to end their career and that's a pathway to exit, or is it not their choice? And essentially, the service is saying, we actually cannot rehabilitate you. So, and not even touching then on those who are administratively separated. And so, I guess depending on why someone's career is ending in the Defence Force, probably does figure in to an extent. Having said that, I've certainly worked with members who are still voluntarily separating. And that sense of, how do I now become a civilian? You know, how do I operate with civilians? And that's often said with a level of disdain, you know, and it might follow up with a, oh, no offense, you know, ma'am, sort of thing to me, or the like. But it's this sort of sense that civilians are, you know, lazy, that civilians don't have those same standards. And whilst it's going to be true that there are certain areas that civilians don't have that same level of requirement, that the service expectations that exist, but often it comes down to also this idea of around values. And so some of that transition space can be that sense of, how am I going to exist in a world that doesn't share what I perceive to be these strong values? Let alone some of the elements you touched on there, which are those anxieties that exist around, oh my God, if I am 5 minutes late, I'm AWOL. And so I've certainly also heard from ex-serving members that even 10 years post-service still carry a level of anxiety about expectation, that to this day, they are still there 5 before the 5, because otherwise their anxiety is so great that they can't function. Even though they rationally get that, as like you said, there's no one that I'm going to get in trouble from, but it's become so ingrained. So yeah, I think there's a range of areas that could be an issue, and I'm happy to drill into those more.
No, I appreciate that, and we can drill into it more. I appreciate that because it definitely ties into something, and I'm thinking I might even just do a little solo video explaining the idea of push-pull factors as well when someone leaves the organization. Is it are you feeling that you were pushed out? And that doesn't just mean medically or admin, right? That is, it's not, it's I wish it was working, but it's not, right? Or are you like, I really want to go to whatever? And it's interesting as well because the stats do show exactly what you were saying, which is that for people who are med separated or admin separated, they are more likely to have adverse mental health outcomes, which I think makes sense because if your career is changed against your will, most people will have a negative outcome. But it's interesting because what I think is that there are some people who leave because they want to leave and they have a job lined up and everything's going to be great, and they actually underestimate that it is still an adjustment. And it's not that you're going to be distressed necessarily. Whenever I tell people I make this podcast and I'll go, oh, you'd be great to interview, can I interview you? They go, I had a really good transition, you don't need to interview me. And I'm like, but I want to capture that because people get this idea of you're doing a transition podcast because everybody loses their shit. And I'm like, they actually don't. And the people that don't often share certain traits. And let's see if we can't get that information out there. And that's even if you are, med separated. It's
Yeah.
interesting what you say around like feeling like you're not of value to the organization. So when I left, I'm very open about kind of my own journey. When I left just like, what do you call it? Just like my own. I just
Voluntarily?
left, chose to
Yeah.
leave, had a job to go to voluntarily. And then I was in the reserve and then I had some medical stuff come up and I was ultimately medically separated, right? And it was exactly what you said, which is that when I went to the doctor, I was like, look, I think this needs to be kind of recorded here. And the doc was really good. The doc was like, if you want it recorded, we should definitely record it because this is stuff that would affect your deployability. Or if you're more comfortable, you can just leave, like you can just stop serving, right? Because as a reservist, it kind of doesn't matter. It's kind of up to you. And I said, oh, look, I think it's important that this stuff is recorded because I'm like in my head, I'm like, because what about when I'm 70 if I need like healthcare for my neck or, et cetera. What I found fascinating is I would view that as very much my own choice, right? Like, yeah, there was health stuff going on, but I was already looking at like maybe it's time to step away from uniform. It was still hard for me as a pretty self-reflective person when I got the paperwork, because the paperwork doesn't say, yeah, there's medical stuff and it'd be good for her to leave. The paperwork says that the retention of Aleesha Shimeld is not in the interests of the ADF.
Mm.
And it's correct. It's not. it's not in their interest because they're going to have to keep paying my medical bills and I'm not going to be contributing to capability. So, like, practically, I get it. But I was like, oh my God, this was a gut punch I was not expecting.
Yeah.
And I'd never thought it through from that angle before. Like, I'd obviously always had empathy for the fact that medical transition is challenging, but I was like, even the language is challenging.
Look, absolutely. And I think that there is that difference, isn't there, around that's the legal language that's in the defense regulation, etc. But that sense of as a human actually receiving that and you being a rational, intelligent woman who's also seen that statement before, because, when we're assessing for suitability, that might be something that we're considering. And yet to see it about yourself, that, as you said, gut punch, that sort of visceral impact of, oh my gosh. Um,
Especially when you're someone who values being of service, right? People that join the ADF and remain in the ADF for as long as I did, that's a value that we have. We value serving. And so to be told, oh, your service isn't worthwhile. And I know that's not what it's saying, right? But that's how it feels. It's interesting. I find the value space so interesting. What you're saying around the idea of I'm going to have to work with civilians. And I had a client, and he's given me permission to share this story. I had a client a few years ago, and he was worried he was going to be separated. He actually wasn't. He still serves, but he was worried he was going to be separated. And at the time, he was on medical leave, and he was like, "Well, I'm not going to be able to work with civilians. They're lazy and they're deros and blah blah blah." And I said, "Hey, I said, look, I'm kind of confused, like where that belief that all civilians are like this comes from." I was like, I'm a civilian, right? Like, clearly. And he's like, oh, no. And I said, and, your partner is a civilian. Does she work hard? Oh, yeah, she works so hard. She's amazing. And I was like, okay. So and I kind of explained in group, out group psychology, right? It's really natural that when someone isn't in our group, if we see one of those, we assume they represent all of those. And I had to explain to him that, like, so he was going to, like, it was in Townsville. He was going to a certain shopping center on, like, a Thursday or something like that. And he was seeing certain people, right? And I said, look, I know that you're seeing a certain kind of person at a certain time of day. I said, one, you're only noticing them. I said, I guarantee you walked past, five people that were just neatly dressed, doing their thing, not shouting at anybody, etc. And he's like, yeah, well, why aren't they at work? And I said, well, why aren't you at work? And he's like, well, I'm on medical leave. And I went, well, maybe they are. And he's like, what? And I said, maybe they are. Maybe they're a shift worker. Maybe this is their weekend. Like, I think it's interesting because if you're not exposed to it and you don't have, like, if you're just not someone who naturally will reflect on it, it's really easy to go, like, oh, they're all lazy. Every civilian's lazy. And I'm like, no, it's just that the people that you interact with are either people you already care about and respect, so you don't view them that way, or they're people you don't know and you have no idea what's going on. But
yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And that we know that, like, as humans, we've got these, heuristics. We make these little shortcuts and it's how we make sense of things. And so we generalize. And I mean, I know I do it, but it's that sense of, are we the sort of person that stops and then reflects on that? And I can hear that in the therapeutic process, there was an opportunity to actually do that. I guess something else that I've certainly heard, and again, it's as a civilian, it's only sharing the perspectives of what others have shared with me, but is also that through particularly the early training continuum and it's probably more other ranks rather than our officers, because I don't think I've heard it from them, but this sense that on the one hand, you show respect to civilians, sir, ma'am, that sort of thing, but always know that you're better than them. And so I guess that when you're also having that narrative provided through your training, it is also going to, of course, then shape how you think of. And so, of course, it could be when you challenge, well, hang on, isn't your wife a civilian? I'm a civilian, etc. You civilians, maybe your parents are civilians. And so this sense that, of course, there can be those, oh, yeah, but they're different. But the way in which also the organisation kind of contributes to that view. And so if exiting means you now have to become one of those lesser beings, even when it's a voluntary separation, for some, that loss of identity as a service member can be significant. And, that's obviously an area that I think things like the Royal Commission, they've been looking a lot more into, is this idea of when that defence or military identity is lost. whatever that means, of course. But when that's lost, that the impacts on mental health, and there's quite a bit of research that's happening nationally and internationally in that space around what that means for mental health. And yeah, I think that that's an important component. And obviously, as an identity researcher, that's a space that I'm very much interested in.
I'm so glad you used that example of that you're literally told that civilians are less than. Because I had a similar conversation with someone who has a completely different professional background than I do. He's in the army, but and I mean all the videos will be online, right? So he's an SASR was an SASR medic, and we were talking about this idea of that you get told that, and for the infantry in particular, they are told, and it's not incorrect, that everything is to support the infantry, which is true, right? At a fundamental level, everything is to support the infantry. And then you go, okay, and who are SASR? They are, and we're not meant to use that word elite anymore, but that's how it used to be. They are the elite. And where do they come from? Usually from the infantry. And so you go, okay, so you're better than civilians. You're better than the rest of the army, like the other corps. You're better than everyone else. And then we get them to leave and then become a civilian. And I completely agree, which is even if you have to be pretty like conscious of not having bought into that to have that not affect you. But the reason that I'm like, oh, I'm so glad you said that because you've dealt with a lot of people in the identity space is I was showing someone like a colleague who serves, I was showing someone the video with some of that theme in it, and he said, you shouldn't say that. No one gets told that they're better than civilians. And I said, that's bullshit. I said, that's absolutely bullshit. I said, the organization certainly doesn't say it. There's no like policy that says it. There's nowhere in the training continuum that says here's a lesson on how you're better than civilians. But it's the air you breathe. It's you do hard stuff and it sucks, but you are tougher than everybody else because you can do it, right? Like, and it's how you get people through hard training. Yeah, this is shit. Yeah, 99% of people couldn't do it, and you're better because you can do it. And we never take time to factor in that there are a lot of people out in the world outside of the ADF who probably would have been great soldiers, but choose not to be for whatever reason. Soldiers, sailors, aviators. And of course, we don't want to have that considered response when we're trying to build esprit de corps, when we're trying to build morale. But it's really interesting when you go, we inadvertently create a perfect storm at the transition point of you can't be one of us and now you have to be one of them. And
Yep.
for 20 years, there's been a low key message that they're not as good as you are. And when I say not as good, I think you got to unpack that a bit, which is it's not about like it is less than, but it's less than in the stuff that people in the ADF value, right? Strength, resilience, like it's this perception of those people haven't been through what we've been through. And it's like, yeah, but once you exist in the world for long enough, you're like, man, I never sort of make an assumption about what someone has experienced. Like, and I think
Mhm.
psychs, we're probably more inclined to do that. But I'm like, yeah, like, like if we use, say, the evacuation of Kabul in 2021, right? Awful, awful stuff. And some, very young soldiers horribly affected by that. Stuff that no one else in Australia can imagine in terms of what they were having to do, turning families away and knowing that they're going to go back out to the Taliban. Like, does the average 19-year-old have that experience? No. But are there 19-year-olds in Australia who have had equally challenging, just different experiences? Yes, absolutely. And I know that because I've worked, in teenage mental health. And I think it's interesting that I'm like, come on, guys, we don't have a monopoly on hard times. There are lots of ways people have hard times. And it's important to like kind of give credit to that as well.
And I guess that, the element is, isn't it, that a lot of this is it's an implicit bias that's been sort of shaped by, in part, the organisation, but in part also what drew you to enlist in the first place. That the amount of stories that I have heard, people's life stories, that is, as far as always wanting to be a soldier or post 9/11, the importance of enlisting then, these things that have motivated, that also contribute to this idea that that service imperative is greater. And in no way, when I say any of this, am I intending to cause any disrespect. But essentially, if we're holding this sort of implicit belief, because as you say, it's not stated. Some people will state it. However, it's not an official stance of the military. But if we're holding that internalized belief, the risk is that if we don't have the opportunity to reflect on that, to think about what that then means for us, there is likely to be a challenge in the transition space when when somebody is becoming the other, and, the other that is or has been perceived as lesser to an extent. And I agree with you in your explanation of what that lesser means. But yeah, this sense of, if I'm going to become that other, what does it mean for me? Who am I now that I'm no longer a serving member? And depending on I'm still a reservist, or whether it is a complete separation, that can vary for individuals. Yeah.
I think there's a reason that a lot of people do. I call it the sideways transition. I'm going to trademark that, by the way, if anyone hears that, that's mine. And the sideways transition is, I'm leaving, but I'm either staying very, very active in the reserve, or I'm working in a field that is very closely tied to defense. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing to sideways transition. I sideways transitioned, right? Like, so I'm not saying it's inherently bad, but I think you need to be aware that at some point, if you choose to then fully transition, it's actually going to be its own thing. Like, we think of transition as, oh, that's the year after you leave. But I'm like, not if you go straight into an APS job and do that for 5 years, working down the hall, seeing all your mates still going to the mess. I'm like, no, 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 your transition hasn't happened yet. Like, some of your transition has happened, but this is going to be an ongoing process. And I was chatting with, so the medic that I'm talking about, he actually now is quite high up in, oh God, what are they called? I'll edit this so I don't look like shitting it. Disaster Relief Australia. So he's quite high up in Disaster Relief Australia, which they get a lot of volunteers to help with things like the floods, etc. Really, really interesting, rewarding work. Really ties into defence values. So they have a lot of ex-ADF members who volunteer. And what he and I were talking about was that he said that for some people he sees that as a real positive, and for others he sees it as actually almost like it's stunting their ability to have grown, because instead of learning to adjust to the new world, they just tolerate the stuff they don't like, and then they come to DRA and they can be with their friends and talk about what it was like in the battalions, and they can engage in those behaviors. And for some people, they're not then growing and getting the skills they need, and it means that they're not as happy as they could be in other environments, which I thought was really interesting. And I think it kind of tracks with stuff that we see as well.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I am conscious, as you rightly said, that there are those who transition quite successfully. I think of my wife, for example. She voluntarily left, but she was going to study. She already had a plan as far as what she was going to do. And for her transition was very smooth, to the point that contacts that still happened after transition that defense made to her, she's like, just leave me alone. I'm done. I don't need that extra support. I'm happy to make that shift. And so, yeah, I find it fascinating. I agree with you as far as, what are the qualities that we might also see in an individual? What might be their service experiences that mean that leaving can be like, yeah, I served, that's something I did, but I don't feel that my identity has now been compromised by my exiting from service, as opposed to somebody who may not feel that same way, regardless of what their exit process was. But I think the other interesting space you're talking about there is that, what do you call it, sideways transition, trademark Aleesha. But you think about even what we know about in the retirement space, that so often people who have worked for long periods of their life, if they just stop work, immediately, there's more likely to be negative mental health impacts. That a graded transition from the workforce is something that the evidence actually supports. Whether that's something that should be being explored or utilized more readily, and whether that is just reserve service. But yeah, we already know in the retirement space the impacts that can happen. And so for defence, there is definitely an area of work to be done. And I know the Royal Commission has certainly recommended work in this transition sort of wellbeing space. But how can that best look to support members? How can that best look in the sense of, We've invested so much into training you, and training not just being the, drill weapons, etc., but training you to be a defense member. What is now the process of deconstructing that? What is it that is valuable to retain and take forward? And what do we need to work to actually, take off that can allow a smoother transition? I think, people much smarter than I am are obviously working in that space. But yeah, that's an area that I look forward to seeing us having a much better understanding.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because I think of my own transition, and like I would rather use examples from other people's, but I want to be respectful of their experience, right? So that's why I kind of just draw on my own. And I think a relatively successful transition, again, sideways. But I think a big part of that, and I have seen this echoed in other people, is that while being in the army was part of my identity, if someone had said to me, "Hey, tell me about yourself," the first words out of my mouth wouldn't have been "I'm in the army." The first words out of my mouth would have been "I'm a psychologist." And so
Yeah.
I remain a psychologist. And I actually think that if for some reason I was ever unable to practice, that I would find more challenging in terms of the value space. Because for me, serving is a key value. Especially, I love the defense community. Clearly, like I don't get paid for any of this. I pay for subscriptions and stuff. Like I want to give to the community. So for me, I meet the value whether I'm in or not. And that's not something that is true for everyone. And I think there's key jobs that I think, and I don't know the data on this. I'd be really interested to see the data. It would make sense to me that there are certain things that you actually can't replicate in the civilian world. And infantry is an easy example, but like if we go to broader cause as well, like when you look at the work that some of the Navy elements do in terms of border protection, there's not an equivalent to that. There's not a civilian equivalent, right?
Yeah.
Fighter pilots, there's not a civilian equivalent. Can they fly a jet for Qantas? Yeah, I'm sure they can. I'm sure it's not the same. Like I have friends that are rotary wing pilots, and most of them have had positive transitions, and it's because they work for places that rescue people.
Yeah.
They transfer the skill across. And the ones who chose not to were because they were feeling burnt out by that aspect. And I think that's interesting is we've got to help. And I'm not saying that the solution to that is not that we don't let these people transition or anything, right? But it's about how do we help that there are certain people who are going to need a different approach to transition than other people, or at least have the option to have further support or yeah. Another thing I sort of think is interesting is, and I think defense could work on this across the board, is that we focus on values and what values are, but we don't kind of explain the impact they can have on someone. And the big one is trying to explain to people that values are important. And if you don't live in accordance with your own values, you will be unhappy. Essentially, in some way, it won't work out for you. And you have every right to only want to the people in your life. It's going to be easier if they share your values, all that, right? Whatever that fits. What we need to remember is that values actually aren't right or wrong. So,
Yeah.
like, my drive to serve is fine, and I have every right to feel valued in that way. Someone who doesn't have that drive and who is like, I want to make art and I don't really care if anybody else enjoys it, that's fine too. Like, it's not actually right or wrong. And I said this once to some quite high level commanders, and it's one of those moments where you go, I've just learned everything I need to know about everyone in this room, which was that 90% of them were like, that's so interesting. I agree. In terms of their kids, they were putting it in the sense of their kids, right? Is, do you care if your child makes lots of money and does this or that, or do you care if your child is happy, right? And the majority of them were like, no, of course. If that is what makes them happy, then I am happy, kind of thing. But some were like, no, it's just fundamentally not okay to not contribute to society. And it's like, you've said that like it's a fact, but that's a value you hold, and not everybody holds the same value. And if you keep thinking everyone holds it, you're going to go crazy.
And I think the other thing is the how we're measuring it, because,
Mm.
like I agree completely with what you're saying. Like I always think about values, and a lot of this comes from, sort of the ACT framework, but values being a direction, then they're not a destination. They're not something that you can check things off along the way. And so, values there's not a specific way of measuring that. And so that's sometimes where we incorrectly, I think, conflate the doing with the measurement of the value. And, someone can still have service values, but they contribute in a different way to how the Defence Force contributes. But whether that is seen as equal is the challenge. And so, that's an area where I think about members that I did have the opportunity to work with in transition, whether that be whilst they were still serving or seeing them as ex-serving, but, in that period following. But oftentimes, essentially, it was about values work. And it was the way in which exploring their defense values, because their defense values don't always align with what either the single service or now the, one defense values are. But they tend to be pretty damn close because actually, as far as values go, they're a good set of values.
They're not bad ones to hold.
No, no, like there's nothing wrong with those, but there's also nothing about those values that as a civilian I go is inherently defense. That I have known many, many, many civilians who hold similar values. They just might be measured in a different way. I've also known service members who perhaps don't hold those same values to the same extent, and potentially they're not really suitable for service. But a lot of times that work is around, let's articulate what those values actually look like and what they mean in practice for you. And let's explore the ways in which you can still be feeling like you're living true to those values, that you're adhering to them. It just might not look the same as it did when you were serving. The challenge, I suppose, and I liked the point you made about the transferable skills. So job roles that have skills that more readily transfer into a civilian equivalent of some level. But I guess that other component is that one thing I'm always conscious of, and I do feel sometimes I have to educate civilians I work with, is that idea that serving in the Defence Force is not a job. That you cannot say, oh, well, I'm a nurse and I've got a nurse identity, and that therefore draws parallels to a military identity because of this professional identity, acknowledging what you said about your psychology identity.
The next word out of my mouth would have been, and I'm in the army, right? Like it's still a key part of the identity. Yeah.
Well, that's it. I mean, you're a military member 24/7. There is no, oh, well, I'm not working now, so I don't have to do that. And I won't mansplain that to you. You obviously know that. But part of it, I guess, is that sense of, there is the job that I do, what my ECN is that means this is my role, thinking again for ORs. That doesn't translate to capture the full realm of what it actually means to serve. And so, some of that value space is about thinking about more broadly than I'll use the inverted commas, but the just what I do, because it is so much more than the specific job tasks.
I also think it's interesting stuff that you probably don't realize is linked to serving is that if you successfully serve for a long period of time, I think this is true of anyone who serves for a successfully long period of time, you have a decent level of frustration tolerance. Like if you've successfully served for over 10 years and you haven't been unwell the whole time, your frustration tolerance is above average. And I would say probably your cognitive flexibility is above average too, of, oh, I'm not going to get word about whether I'm going interstate until the day before. That's fine. Like it is what it is. Like I reckon if you could somehow make, they make those word clouds of like what's been published the most and you can see it. The biggest word you would get from like defense therapy is it is what it is. Like
Yeah.
and it's a thought terminating cliche in therapy. You hate to hear it. You go, but what does it mean? What does it mean if it is, but it's because it's super, super adaptive to just go, no, it's above my pay grade. I don't know and I won't know and I just have to tolerate it. But you don't even know that you do that until you go to an environment where people don't cope with it. And then it becomes an interpersonal challenge. And I've seen that in like one of my colleagues who I think is just like a great, great person, but she has like the lowest tolerance for ambiguity. And I'm like, does she have low tolerance for ambiguity or does she have an average amount? And I just have unreasonably high expectations. And I think the same thing with just in that space of like your perception of what is normal gets shifted is we talked about that maybe the generational thing is more concentrated perhaps in defense. The other one is when I stepped out from defense and was working with teenagers for a bit, my supervisor was very, very patient with me because I remember saying like, oh, I feel like this person's, maturity is probably not where we would expect it to be for their age. And they were 18 or 19. And my supervisor was like, "That's interesting. Have you written that kind of in your report?" And I said, "Yeah." And they were like, "Okay." And I said, "Look, let's just. I want you to sit with that for a week, and I want you to think about maybe that your perception of what the average 18 or 19-year-old's maturity is might have been skewed." And then I was like, "Actually, yeah, I think it's we're sometimes so unkind to our young members at this idea of like the quote, and I'm sure you've heard it is diggers gonna dig, right? Like in the sense of young diggers get into mischief, etc. I'm like, they do. And it's not because they're idiots. It's because they're doing very, very age appropriate things. We just expect so much of them. Like our expectations are actually so high. And I know that you'd have a lot of people go, it's not as bad as it was back in my day. I'm like, no, no, no. The stuff we ask these kids to do is actually incredible. And I think we should acknowledge that a bit more. That's just my soapbox. That's not even relevant to this. But it becomes relevant when they leave at 22 and they then are among what should be their peers and they're like super frustrated by what they're seeing because they're like and then they become I love it when you meet like a young veteran who has served and who has like been in the shit but is only 23 and they're like, oh man, these kids don't get it, they don't know what the world's about, kind of thing. And you're like, yeah, I can imagine that is so frustrating for you.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, I feel the same thing with some members of my family, and they listen. Like I know they will listen to this, so I'm not going to say who. But sometimes I am just like, there's things that I don't bother talking about because I'm like, they truly don't understand things about how the world works. In terms of, if you look at even like Ukraine, Russia, some of the complexities there, I'm like, unless I want to spend my day explaining this to someone who doesn't really have a desire to learn, there's actually no point, and I'm just going to get myself spun up. And something that's important to me doesn't have to be important to everyone. But unfortunately, I think we inadvertently, and when I say we, as an organization, I mean as an organization, defense. And it's interesting, isn't it? Like when you talk identity, I still say we, and I'm not in defense.
Mm.
But I don't think I'll ever not say we. I wonder how long that would take me. Maybe 10 years. The organization still inadvertently teaches this is the way to be to thrive here, which for the most part is correct. And it is also the correct way to be. And it's like, no, no, no. One of those isn't true. And one of them is actually only half true anyway, which is, do you need to be able to push past discomfort? Yes. Do you need to, at times, not have an emotional response, shut that part of your brain down and think it through logically? Yes. That doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do every single time, but we teach it like lowest common denominator. Like it's almost like we don't trust people to figure out the nuance. And I'm like, I actually think that's really unfair. You trust someone to interpret rules of engagement in a kinetic environment, but you don't trust them to know that sometimes it's okay to shout and sometimes it's not okay to shout.
Yeah. Yeah.
Feel like I got us very off track. I apologize. To get us more back in the transition space and in terms of your research as well, I'm wondering if you see anything that is like maybe particularly different in terms of transition for people that maybe weren't, I don't want to say just for women because I think there are men that don't, maybe their identity wasn't fitting with it to begin with. Because intuitively what you would think is, oh, if it's hard to be there, it becomes, they have an easier transition. But then I'm like, I don't know that that can be correct because you spend so much time doubting yourself. So I'm curious, like, kind of what your thoughts are in that space.
Yeah, I guess, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I don't certainly my observation, and these are of course just my observations. So some of it comes from what the research tells us, but a lot of it is actually just the clinical work that I've done or, people I've spoken to. So, some is certainly the world according to Carolyn through the lens of other people.
Think, and I hate to interrupt, but I think it's really important when you or I talk about this is what I've seen, between the two of us, I reckon we've seen easily 10,000 ADF members. You know what I mean? Over our careers. And the scientist practitioner in me goes, yes, but there would be some overlap. Yeah, that's true. If we assume at a conservative measure that we've seen between the two of us, we've seen 5,000 people, and I truly think that would be conservative. I'm like, yeah, it is the world according to us, but we're being shaped by that. Like, I think that is an important distinction to make. Like, you're not, when I talk about me and then I say this stuff, I'm not talking about just me. And you're not just talking about, I saw this in my wife. You're talking about, I saw this in 300 people at one base.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's it. And so I guess that there are those who perhaps seem to align better, that's the wrong choice of word, but seem to more successfully perhaps align with the identity of being a defense member, whether that be the loyal soldier. And I know I speak a lot about soldiers, and that's probably because most of my clinical work, I should say, has been predominantly with Army. And so I do appreciate that I'm not always offering the perspective of our, sailors or aviators. But essentially, I guess there are those who more embody the identity, whether that be the loyal service personnel, the warrior, and there can be a challenge in taking that off in that transition space. And I guess there is some research that suggests that when people exit from defense, maintaining some form of connection to their service can be very important. But for individuals who see defense more as sort of family, there's some research that suggests that that can be more of a difficult transition space. And I suppose that loss of family in many ways makes sense. But similarly, those who perhaps haven't, and I wanted to use the term assimilated, which is probably, again, not the correct term.
Say they're closely aligned, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. Who haven't as readily aligned, and whether that's because they've had to hide parts of their identity in order to fit in, or compartmentalize parts of themselves to fit in, or whether because that identity has been somehow disrupted. And I guess this is the area where, some of my research has explored studies across the globe around the way in which identities become disrupted within defense. And that can be for a myriad of reasons, but certainly mental health problems and the stigma and the self-stigma, really importantly. So not just the stigma from the organization, but the self-stigma, the buying in essentially to that masculine ideal of being able to handle whatever's thrown at you. Moral injury, which we could obviously talk to, I think, for many, many podcasts on, but the way in which exposure to elements that compromise that sort of moral or values element, acknowledging what the Defence Force exists for, but we still know that there are moral insults that do occur, and they're often far, far more difficult to treat than, say, a PTSD, where I've been exposed to something horrific, but it hasn't actually compromised my moral values. Other areas where, just to briefly touch on, that we see disruption is that space where people have enlisted with the intent to deploy and to deploy to a combat zone and haven't had that opportunity for whatever reason. And so that sense that they've somehow failed as a service member, because that's what they joined for. That's what being a defense member means. We deploy. And so where that hasn't occurred, or where the deployment's been to a peacekeeping or humanitarian deployment, not everyone, but certainly there are examples of those who feel that it's therefore lesser. And so they've failed. They've failed at that service expectation. And so I guess that then when we think about that transition space, even those who have had somehow a disrupted identity, that doesn't mean that there's then this smooth transition, because, they didn't have the defense identity, the typical defense identity. There's often then that mourning of what wasn't achieved, or the mourning of not being able to separate on your own terms because you feel that you're no longer upholding that defense ideal, or your service retention is not in the interests of the Defence Force. And so in that space, this idea of where that identity can be lost and what that means, that's where I'm really curious in us understanding a lot more about how identities are developed in the first place in the Defence Force, but so that we can then better understand the deconstruction of them. Because whether someone successfully, and that might not be, again, the best choice of word, but whether they do align more with the traditional defense identities, or whether their identity has somehow been disrupted or has had to be compartmentalized, we see transition challenges in both groups.
There's a few things you've said there that I like. I love all of it. There's a few things I want to unpack more. One, it's interesting, that idea of identity being disrupted. So I had a client a few years ago, and again, these are people who I've reached out to and made sure they're comfortable. I'm not obviously identifying anyone, but I want to be really respectful of people's experience. And he said something super interesting, which was, he was a young gay guy. He'd been out since he was, 14, and he sort of made a joke. He was like, I wasn't really so much out as just everybody knew. And I just was like, yeah, I want to start dating, really, like in the same way that any 14-year-old might, right? And it was fine, family, supportive. but went to a particular kind of school where it was like, oh, you kind of got to be like, it's fine that you're gay, but you don't talk about it, right? And as a young kid, really, he's like, okay, whatever, you're pretty compliant at that age in terms of that's okay because if your family's supporting you, whatnot. Joined the ADF, was felt supported in the ADF, no issues, no issues, went to a new unit. So maybe I think this was his third unit by this point. And that culture, whatever, key players felt he had to go back in the closet. That alone, and I say alone knowing that that's huge, right? Like, but that alone was the catalyst for really, really a challenging time in his mental health because we all work hard to accept who we are, and that is easier or harder for some people depending on how we align with what society expects of us.
Yep.
And he was almost having to go through this time that I think like a lot of people probably go through when they're a bit younger when they're realizing stuff about their sexuality. He'd gotten quite comfortable with it and then gone, oh, wait, now as 24, 25, I'm being told it's not okay. This is very confusing. And also, I want to date. I can't date. I'm dating, but I can't bring people to this function. Like and then that causes more pressure because his 25-year-old partner is like, this is insane. Why can't I come to your work function? And I think it's interesting what you say there, which is that it can disrupt identity as well. And that reminds me of someone I've spoken to recently for the podcast, and she gave me permission to record it. And between the two of us, we actually made a decision that we've recorded the podcast, but I'm not using any of her like live because some of the stuff is still too sensitive, and what I don't want is for her to feel that she's like being placed under scrutiny and there's a lot to the story, but a big part of it is that she was a young serving member, a young soldier. She kind of did those things that we talk about in terms of playing the game of I've got to be just enough, not too much. I've got to work twice as hard, but I can't show people I work twice as hard because then I'm a thruster. And I have to be popular, but I can't be so popular that people notice that I'm popular. Otherwise, people assume I'm popular because I'm sleeping with someone, all of that, all of that, all of that. And then she was unfortunately sexually assaulted by someone in the workplace. And it was like so detrimental, obviously, because that's a traumatic experience anyway. But what was interesting was that the key thing was, but this shouldn't have happened to me because I was doing all of the right things that keep me safe. And she was
Played
able
the game.
I played the game, right? Like, and I think that's true. She didn't articulate this specific part, but this is something I've heard other people articulate is that there was a part of them where they were like, when they would hear someone was assaulted, when they would hear this, they would of course be like, that's awful. But they would go, oh, but she did blah. She did this, she did that, right? And it's actually, I always sort of say to people, because they feel bad when they sort of confess that. And I always say to people, it makes sense that we do that because we want to think we can keep ourselves safe. And the easiest way to think you can keep yourself safe is when you hear of something bad happening to someone else, you think that won't happen to me because of this, and this. And that's the same for anything, right? Financially, if I hear someone loses their house, the first thing I want to do to reassure that distress in me is go, oh, this is why that wouldn't be my problem. But then when it does happen and you're like, but I did everything, it's terrifying because, people join defense. A lot of people join defense because they want a place where they feel like a family or like that we're a team and teamwork is a core value. So it's one thing to be assaulted by a guy on the street. It's another thing to be assaulted by the guy that is meant to be in the trench with you. Like I think it's a uniquely challenging experience that people don't realize the far reaching effects of. And for her, what that looks like was she dealt with the initial like incident, but she then went on to be someone who she would have a pretty strong reaction to certain aspects of management because with that history you can understand it, and also because and I don't think this gives anything away to say this because unfortunately it's a common story. When she reported it, she was told, look, we'll report this if you want, but it'll be your word against his. You'll have to do this, this, and this. Are you sure you want to do that, right? And so she was like, oh, actually, no, I don't. Young soldier, maybe better off just let it go. So she's being told, we chain of command, we take care of you, but then her internal experience is not that she's been taken care of. And then the challenge is with postings that, she posts, she promotes, and she had a very successful career. You post, you go to a new location, and again, you have to prove yourself. And they don't know your history, and they don't really want to know your history. And you are expected also to not bring any of that. And I think everyone understands this purely from like a workload perspective, which is you could have had the worst 2 years of your life in terms of workload, but your new CEO does not care. Like your new CEO doesn't go, you've given a lot to the organization, take a couple of months for yourself. He goes, we're hitting the ground running. This is my 2 to 3 years, boom, boom, boom. And that's how the organization works. But
Yes.
I think for a case like this, it really struck me as there was a specific example she gave, and I'm not going to use that just because of the risk of identifying people, of someone then in a chain of command, 5 chain of commands later, has treated her in a way that was catastrophic for her. And while I don't think it was good management, that person would have no idea why this person has had the reaction. And then they just go, she's weak. She's not
Yeah.
resilient. And like, she's remarkably resilient, but you don't have the context and you don't want the context.
Yeah. And I think the horrifying elements of that is, when we're thinking about military sexual trauma, is that what we're also talking about is that often there is that moral injury that gets tied up in that, and that's the betrayal of the organization. And so, it's an area where there's been an awful lot of investigation, even in a civilian space. So when individuals bring sexual assaults cases and attempt to seek justice, how, the criminal justice system has been described as the second rape, that
Yeah.
what individuals, victim survivors have to go through in order to reach this sense of justice. And again, I'm using the inverted commas because that's a whole other area. But the other element, I guess, is in the military is that there can be the civilian, criminal investigation around a sexual assault or rape. Often that doesn't happen, but when it is also brought to the attention of the military, and I know there has been changes in this process, but I've worked with a number of clients who have been, or are victim survivors of military sexual trauma, and often how the unit handled it, the fact-finding missions, the forced to give evidence, etc., that just doesn't mirror the protections that should also be provided to an individual. And so there's an element that can exist in that space as well around that betrayal of, again, the organization that is meant to be your family, the organization that is there to protect and provide that support, can also be the source of this sense of betrayal. And so 100% I can hear that, for that individual, strong, resilient, without question, but is carrying this injury through various postings, and the way in which, as humans, something happens that brings up that previous interaction, and the reaction feels so out of character to anyone observing it. But of course, through our psych lens, we can go, well, that makes complete sense. Doesn't always make sense to the individual either. And I've certainly worked with individuals who are like, I don't understand why, I'm over that. I've dealt with that. It's now X amount of years later. But the way in which, particularly, I think sexual trauma in general, but certainly in the military context, that there is the layered element of the trauma itself, which is not to be under,
Yeah, that is
valued.
absolutely its own thing anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
But is the organization, and that's that space where I would see it as a moral injury. It's that betrayal, or that perception of betrayal, which is sometimes because of the system and following the rules of the system. And sometimes it's also because those who are in leadership positions aren't always well prepared or trained to work in, say, a trauma-informed framework. And yeah, again, people far, far smarter than me will have ideas around how to better do that. Uh, but yeah, the impact that then happens again on identity around what the experience of a sexual assault can do.
Definitely have treated people who at some point the treatment stops being about the assault and it starts being about what the organization did or didn't do, or and I guess, to be fair, it's not even sometimes the organization. The policies are pretty clear, and there are a lot of improvements. The MPs now
Yep.
have a social worker that works with them in these
Yes.
cases, which I think is amazing. There are still individuals who they don't realize the harm they're doing. Like when I think of that example of telling her, you can take it forward but be your word against his, etc., blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that's not untrue. Like that is how these cases go, and it is hard. But I'm also like, yes, but there's not a woman in the world who doesn't know it's hard to prove sexual assault, because you realize it from a very young age, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
it's not like when they told her that, that's why she went, oh, I didn't realize and I don't want to deal with it. It's because they told her and she went, oh, there's an implied thing, which is you think it's not worth it, and that's why you're telling me. And as a young soldier, and she was a very young soldier, and this person outranks her, the whole thing. In and as well with what you were saying before, just in terms of the if there's something that ruptures identity, deployment I think is so interesting. So I'm interviewing someone next week, and he was part of SASR in the 90s before the deployments kicked off, and he just happened to get out right before they kicked off. And that was, I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but they had a really shit run there in terms of people dying in training accidents, which is true, like in defense, right? It's actually people have been, in Darwin, there was that horrible thing with the live fire exercise that went wrong. And, but it's interesting that he was willing to talk to me about his experience about that it is hard because there is an idea, which is if you're in defense, then you must have deployed. But especially if you're in defense and you are having mental health challenges, obviously that is because you were in combat. And it's like,
Correct.
actually, that's not what the statistics say. The statistics say
Yep.
that there are a shitload of people who go through combat without an adverse trauma reaction for various reasons. And a big part of it is the moral injury piece, which is that if the activity doesn't go against your morals, it's much less likely to be traumatizing. And if you feel that it's a just fight, and when it is more straightforward, when I'm here and someone's firing at me and my mate's here and we're going to fire back. It's
Mhm.
actually, and I'm not saying that it's not, doesn't carry risks and that, for some people that is still super challenging, but it's not that everyone who experiences that will struggle. And I'm really glad that he's going to take that time. But it's something that I think is interesting too, is that whenever you get into, I'm really passionate about veterans' mental health, people take it immediately to deployments. And I'm like, I'm very happy to talk about that. And there's a lot in that space, but I'm like, that's not the be all and end all. And also, people serve the organization and Australia and have done amazing things without ever deploying. And, I think anybody who has been rescued by boat during a flood and that was an army helicopter team can say that. Like, it doesn't matter it's like that there's something meaningful to helping the people around you, but it's not necessarily what we are sort of culturally told is what is valuable about serving.
I agree wholeheartedly. And again, the research certainly aligns with that concept of the identity being somehow failed if you didn't deploy. But absolutely, I mean, it's certainly been my experience whenever I've met individuals and I've spoken about, and they're like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, a psychologist, civvy psychologist, but I work with the Defence Force. Oh, you must see a lot of PTSD. And it's like, well, yes, I do work with trauma. However, if your belief is because you think it's all combat related, you are sadly wrong. And again, thinking about mental health injury, but the other thing I thought of as you were talking about that is physical injury, and the knowledge that the vast majority of physical injuries are caused during, well, certainly can be training exercises, but it's also often just through basic. And so this sense of, is my injury as valid as the person who was injured on deployment? Or is my moral injury because of my experience in a garrison type setting as valid as someone who has that from a deployment experience? And this sense that the deployment or deployments are considered more of that pinnacle. But that's also shaped, I agree with you, from what society is expecting as well and what society believes being a defence member is. And so, yeah, that's a really difficult space, is the way in which deployments contribute to what we see clinically, but often where they do contribute, or at least my experience is more so with the sense of being messed around on deployment.
Yeah.
That sense of being
Bad
being
team on
told.
deployment, like a toxic team on deployment, that can be really challenging
Correct.
too.
Absolutely. So the individuals that come back and often are then diagnosed with PTSD, but that diagnosis is, yes, they've got a trauma, but it's not in the way that we understand PTSD. It's not a big T trauma. It was the environment they were in. The individuals who feel as if their command have somehow misled them as far as the level of threat that they will be under. And so living in the sort of constant state of threat that doesn't play out, and then coming to understand that as being, it was amplified. And I guess their perspective is that it was amplified unnecessarily. And so again, I guess I touch on that idea of the moral injury, but it's that betrayal side that really comes through. And so, yeah, the civvy perspective of deployment injury is usually PTSD and IED impacts. And yet clinically, that's a far smaller component of work that I've ever done. It is far more commonly the purse relationships on deployment, the adjustments. It can also be, of course, the observation of being in a deployed environment that is so very different to the Australian environment, and returning and seeing the level of privilege essentially that we have here. And then the lack of tolerance for us whinging about our first world problems when, yeah, there's been that perception. So there's certainly, I've seen impacts from deployments, but it's usually not how an awful lot of society thinks that
Yeah.
impact would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I mean the like if you look at even to go back as far as Rwanda, right? What we know is that a big negative impact of that, and this is all public record now, so I don't feel bad talking about this, but what we know is that it wasn't that they had to do something and that is what traumatized them. It was they could not do something and they were watching atrocities happen. And
Absolutely.
that's Australian rules of engagement a lot of the time for really good reason. I'm not saying that that we should necessarily get involved, but I'm like, I think that people underestimate you're a young person who wants to serve, is physically fit, is in the prime of their life, who knows they can throw down, basically, and your convoy is going to roll past a woman being abused and you're not going to do anything. Or, in terms of some of the conflicts we're in, there are really, really big cultural differences around how to treat children and stuff. How many people, I'm sure you're the same, of if you were to go through, like, there's a form that we use, the what is it, LEC 5, right, about for trauma, and we're looking for what you're calling the big T traumas, or if people, like the DSM, it's criterion A events. And what's interesting is that they would have all of them. They'd be like tick tick tick, did that, did that, did that. But the thing that's bothering them is, I was doing reconnaissance, and through the binos I could see a kid being abused, and I had a rifle, and I knew the range on the rifle, and I knew I could make it, but I knew that I couldn't. And again, like, ethically, it's such a gray area, right? Because ethically, there's a lot of people who'd go, well, why wouldn't you? And you're like, oh, because you've given away your position, you've gone against rules of engagement. It's a war crime, right? But then it's fascinating because, and I won't get too into that space because let's not get cancelled, but the people who are the first to go, well, they shouldn't do war crimes. I'm like, you wouldn't even know which was a war crime and which was legal. Like, if you were in that environment, you would have no idea, right? It's really, really easy to act like, oh yeah, this is cut and dry. I'm like, it's actually not cut and dry. And I think that's another challenge too, is that then you're naturally, people are going to ask you stuff and not understand it. And I see that in my own family, and I will do this shout out, and my brother-in-law can get annoyed, that's fine. I remember once he asked my husband, who, like I said, been, infantry officer, deployed, he was like, oh, did you have to kill anyone? And my husband just got up and left the table and just didn't answer. And because, like, and I think we just didn't talk about it, but there's a part of me that wants to talk to him about that and just go, here's why you should never ever ask anyone that. And it's because there's actually no right answer for a defense member, right? Like, you're not going to go, yeah, I did, and it was amazing, because that's insane, because you're a psychopath. If you did and it was upsetting, why would I talk about that at the dinner table? If you didn't, that doesn't mean that you weren't in the shit, and that it can bring back a lot of stuff. And the reason I say, I'll say, I drop my brother-in-law in it. I'm like, to be fair, he didn't mean anything by it. He just doesn't realize. But that's the environment. I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to take up your whole day. To my mind, I'm like, we got about 15 more minutes. Is that all right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, cool. So I guess with all that, and we've gone all over the place, I feel like I should have interviewed you first, but then in some ways I'm like, no, then I'd be too spoiled. That bit's getting cut out. So we've covered, I guess, a lot of topics there, some probably not relevant to transition, some that people are going to have issues with, and that's totally fine. I like that. All engagement is positive. There's no such thing as bad publicity. If someone were leaving, what is, say, the one thing that you would encourage them to do, whether that's a practical thing or a thought exercise or a conversation to have? You can say more than one, but I didn't want to put you under too much pressure.
I was like, oh my God, what is the one thing?
But you could say 15 if you like. Like, I don't mind.
Yeah. No, I think the reality is that it's And this, it's going to feel wanky because this is something I keep hearing used more and more nowadays. And it feels like it's become rather like trivial, but it's that idea of knowing your why. Like, why service? Why are you separating? But in knowing that, I think that contributes a little bit more to this concept of values. And so that idea of, again, not rattling off that you know what the screes are or whatever, but the values for you. And so that manner of how do you maintain that concept moving forward? And depending on who I was working with, my language might be different around that. Like I certainly don't speak about values using the language of values with every individual, but it's that sense of how do I retain these elements of me that have been positive in service? How do I retain that sense of myself as I transition out? Obviously, my key area of interest is around identity, so it always comes back to that for me. And so this idea of loss of identity, that yes, you may be taking the uniform off. Yes, the job role you performed, you're not going to be doing. But the things that led you to serve, in what manner can they be continued post-service? In what ways can you retain that element? And that could be within your family, that could be within another job role, that could be within community service. Like there's so many elements that make up who we are, even for service members, where I acknowledged earlier, of course, I do not believe for a second that it is a job,
Yeah.
but also our service members. And you've given a number of examples of individuals you've spoken to recently, but also worked with in your own experience. You are comprised of these other elements as well. And so similarly in separation, all of those elements continue to exist. And so, yeah, it's really thinking about that and the way in which you can continue those things that are important to you. But that could look like anything. And I think that at least my observation of those who have more successfully transitioned, in the sense of successful being that idea of, yeah, I served, but I can move forward. I don't have any mental ill effects. I don't have this sense that I've lost something. Often that the elements of their defense identity are still present. Those values are still there. It just doesn't look the same as when they were serving. And so I guess that's the part that I don't think is a singular answer by any means. But that's the part that kind of stands out for me, is really kind of getting to the core of, well, what does service mean? What was my why? And what are the ways that I don't have to lose that in no longer being a defense member? How can I continue that? That would be kind of it.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good, and it aligns with what I guess I obviously had my own approach, and the the people that I think have had what we would call successful transitions, they're all doing a version of that in different ways. And I think another important thing you said there was around, like, what is a successful transition? A successful transition is that I I don't regret serving. I'm happy to have served. I'm proud of my service, and I'm doing this. Where I think some people go, we think of unsuccessful as, oh, couldn't let go, but I think unsuccessful can also be, my only way to make this work is to never talk about serving. And I'm
Yeah.
sure you've met people like that, and you're like, it's actually not psychologically sort of robust either. Whereas for me, I'm like, I'm very, very proud of the work I did when I served. And I would say, probably to this day, the things, if I were to say, what is the thing in my career I'm the most proud of, it would be something when I was serving. But I put that down to more because for my adult life, I served for most of it. There are things that I have done in the 3 years since I've got out that I'm also extremely proud of, that are top 10, right? And it's interesting because in terms of that, figuring out your why, an activity that I do sometimes with clients is, it's very common. People go do a pros and cons list, right? Do a pros and cons list. Yeah, absolutely. But actually do a, what do you get from serving? Like, what benefit do you get from serving? And what do you not like about serving? And I'm talking about pros and cons for people who are ambivalent, right? Because obviously if you're being admin separated, let's not make ourselves upset. But but what do you get from it and what don't you like? And actually you've got to really make sure that, one, that those things that you don't like aren't just job stuff, Because you do get some people who go, I'm sick of being told what to do. And you're like, yep. And in defense, being told what to do is very different than if you work at Woolworths. But are you still going to have to be told what, like, figure out what that means for you? But then what do you get from it? And I think the what do you get from it is important, whether you're leaving of your own volition or not, because then what the next step to that is, and how do I meet that need once I'm out? And so for me, if I were to do that, what did I get from defense? I like to be physically fit. I take pride in being strong and I like to train. So yeah, it was easier because in defense I didn't have to pay, like it was part of my day. But am I capable of fitting that in? Yes, I am, because there's been times when I was really busy, even as an officer, where I trained at, 4 in the morning. It wasn't actually part of my workday. So it's like, okay, that's important, but here's how I'm going to meet the need. Or, yeah, it's important to me to serve my community. Well, I'm going to keep working here and I'm going to do my podcast. Or, I think there's a reason why lots of defense members are drawn to police and fireys and whatnot, which is fine. But equally, I'm like, let's think about what these values mean. As you said, it's a value, it's not a goal, it's not a behavior. There are other ways to actually feel that you're living in accordance with your values. So I think that's a pretty good one. I think I'll give you that. You're probably the winner so far. And the other one was a magic question that I told you about earlier, which I love, which is, if you could change one thing about how defense does business, what would you do? You can change anything. It's such an awful question to put on someone because it's so big.
It really is. I think it's that idea you were speaking of before around the ability to be adaptable, in that sense of, yes, when someone's deployed and, you're in a firefight and you need to have action right now, how you speak to that person, you are not necessarily going to filter through the frontal lobes as far as what's the appropriate way to do this. But knowing that when you're in a garrison environment and someone messes up, that speaking to them in that same manner is not preparing them for that deployed environment. And so I guess that the thing that I would change is yes, that recognition that in preparing individuals for that deployed environment does not mean that how you train them in a garrison environment, like that there needs to be adaptability and there needs to be a recognition of how humans actually learn and develop. I am very conscious, of course, that in me saying that, I'm a civvy. And so I'm always cautious of well, you should do it this way, because there are limits in what I do actually know and the like. But yeah, I think it's about preparing our leaders, probably especially our junior leaders, to better understand how to get the best out of people. There are definitely those who successfully navigate even with not great junior leaders or senior leaders. And so again, there is an individual component, but there are also those who could equally be very good service members, but there is damage that occurs because of that lack of flexibility in how we train, that we potentially lose someone. So yeah, I don't think it's great. I don't think I'm going to give you the nice magic answer.
I don't think
But
there is a magic answer, but I think it's a fun activity. I love what you've just said. And it's interesting that you go, I'm just a civilian, I don't want to tell you what to do. So when I was a reservist, I was the Combat Training Center consulting psychologist. And my main job was to teach the mentors like how to teach people better. And I don't want to take credit for that, because there's also like a director of education there and whatnot. But I was very much in the like physiological aspects of learning space. And what I found interesting was that initially you get resistance to this idea for the reasons we've talked about, which is they need to be able to handle being shouted at. I'm like, I'm actually not saying that we're never going to shout at them. What I'm saying is that shouting at them to teach them something doesn't work. Once someone knows something and the neural pathways there, fucking shout all you want. I don't care. But you're actually working at cross purposes. Like, this isn't me being a nice person. This is me going, as I've said, my spouse serves. At the end of the day, what I want is a whole bunch of people who, if he were beside them, they can keep him safe, right? So I'm like, I have a very vested interest in this being an effective fighting force. And the way you get an effective fighting force is by supporting learning. And there are physiological elements to learning. And one of them is that people don't learn when they're under threat, right? And then people take it to the deployment place. And I go, yeah, but actually we don't want no one should be going into a contact in Afghanistan not knowing how their rifle works, right? Like that's so obvious. So we don't have to teach them how to use the rifle by shouting at them. We get them that skill and then we build up. And the thing is, the Army training continuum completely understands that because weapons lessons slow, slow, what is it? Slow is smooth, smooth is fast or whatever, we take it steady, we don't shout, you get confident, we go to the wets, we get it with this stuff, but what we don't
Mm.
get is that you can't stress someone into making a good decision. It just doesn't work that
Yep.
way. That they
Yep.
actually already need neural pathways to be developed. So I think like and again, this is a better minds than us with more funds than us, right? But I think what it comes down to is somewhere in the training continuum, probably very early in the training continuum, really basic stuff around this. The same reasons that this is how we teach weapons are why we need to teach tactics in the same way, or why we need to assess tactics the same way we initially assess weapons handling, because people aren't going to make a good decision when you fire off their threat response. But once they learn those processes and they rehearse, they will draw on a good decision when they're under threat. And so yes, eventually you can shout right in their face, and that'll be a key part of the training, right? Like, but I just think there needs to be more space for nuance. But, in saying that, and obviously I've served, I'm also not a war fighter, and I get that, and that I don't, I would never try to pretend that I can understand the whole thing, because I think there are roles that I can never, that none of us will ever fully understand and be able to consider, but that's why we have the discussion, and that's why we want to make sure we've got the right people at the table. And I also just
Agree.
want to say, as much as you said, and I appreciate you sort of saying, oh, you've worked mainly with Army, and we probably defaulted to sort of Army stuff. What's really interesting in the identity space, and I don't know the stats on this, but I know the stats from a transition angle, is that Army and Navy are more likely to have a problematic transition than Air Force are. And I wonder, I'm sure you could like align the studies there, because I'm like, yeah, and Navy has a really strong culture, just like Army does too. It's different to Army's culture, but they have really strong specific cultural stuff going on. And Air Force actually, it still has its own culture, but it's not as different to civilian culture. And I'm not saying it's the same. Raffies, don't come for me. I've got a Raffie I'm interviewing as well. Don't you worry. But there's clearly a benefit to that, right? And also, it's clearly not affecting their capability that their culture is more aligned, because they have different roles. But I think all services need to be more willing to learn from each service and pull the best parts, because you're like, it's a defense force, right? Like, I see that with Navy, is that Army got into the coaching space in the last 5 years, and so much of what is revolutionary there, Navy was doing 15 years ago. And it's like, this is interesting. And I know there's work at a quite high level to be like, we don't want silos. We actually want training continuums to be similar and stuff. And I think that's awesome. But I think that's a piece to the puzzle as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really do appreciate it. I know you're busy. And is there anything you want to spruik while you've got the airwaves? If not, you tell
Well,
me later.
no, I think that it is rather timely. As I mentioned early on, that yes, I am a PhD candidate, so I am currently seeking, particularly ex-serving soldiers, specifically other ranks. So I'm interested in, privates through to warrant officers, and the area that I'm exploring currently is around the construction of the soldier identity. And so, of course, it feeds into the transition piece, and that's what originally drew me to this research. But essentially, we're focusing a lot on how to deconstruct that identity. My rationale is we need to know a little bit more about how it's constructed in the first place. And so I know defense will give me their perspective on how that is done and, how the training continuum, for example, contributes to that. But it's actually those individuals who have served that I want to hear from. And so I'm seeking individuals who are willing to sit down and allow me to interview them. And from that, I hope to be able to develop a framework that assists us to better understand that. And ideally, that's with the intent of being able to inform both the defence organisation, but also healthcare providers, psychologists, to be able to better support members whilst they're serving, but also in that transition space. So if any of your listeners are willing to give up some time, I'm happy to share some more information about that. But yeah, I'd love if they were willing to talk to me.
Yeah, and just clarifying, you can do remote interviews as well, so they don't have to be in Townsville.
Absolutely. So we can set up that via Teams, Zoom, whatever their preferred sort of modality is, 100%.
I hope people do get behind that, because one of my big bugbears, I'm sure it fits into the values, is I don't mind if people want to complain about stuff, but then do something with it, especially when people have great ideas, but they do it in a vacuum. And often that vacuum is Instagram comments on the Pineapple Express. And I do love the Pineapple Express, so that's not a dig against them. I would have one of those guys on, but they can't ever show their face or they'll be in trouble.
Yeah,
But like griping is like there's something to that, right? And it's obviously that there's a frustration. But whenever we get an opportunity to actually get this information out there, we should take it, and that's how we're going to make change. Because one thing that I really respect about you is that as you've said it, like even though you're a civilian, oh my God, that language, you're a civilian, but and you naturally recognize your own bias, which is that you're going to focus on individuals, but you get that it's an organization that has a specific role. And the goal of any of this and of these discussions is not let's be kinder to people because it's nice, even though it is
mm,
nice. It's let's look at, are we approaching things the best way to have an effective fighting force now and in 5 years and in 10 years. Actually, that's where all this is for. Because as you said, this will help health providers, but this will help defense to know what else could we be doing. Because if we can get the identity
absolutely.
thing right, then people might actually stay in longer as well.
Look, absolutely. The reality is that whilst what drew me to it is my interest in individual, the serving member or the ex-serving member. But if that also contributes to then how defense operates and from a retention perspective, then that is understandably a benefit that we would be seeking. And so ultimate goal is the well-being of our individual service members. However, yeah, if we can also bring about change in an organization to further contribute to that, then that's definitely going to be a benefit.
No, awesome. Thanks again to Carolyn for taking that time with us this morning. I hope that you guys really found something valuable in that. I know that I found it to be a really valuable discussion. I also recognize that some of what Carolyn and I talked about has the potential to feel uncomfortable or make people feel a bit challenged, because this is serious stuff that we're talking about in the sense of how do we have an effective fighting force? What traits does that require? How do we keep people psychologically well, but also fighting fit? Are those the same thing, etc.? So please, if you profoundly disagree, drop it in the comments, send me a message. Happy to have a dialogue about that. Love that to be on the comments instead of in a message, because I think let's get other people's take as well. And Carolyn is open to coming back for another session if that's something that we want to do in the future. The other thing is, if anything's brought up something challenging for you, please use the supports available to you. There are some obviously in the comment section. And just remember that nothing that we've said now or that I ever say on this is individual health advice. You know yourself and you have to take care of yourself. But as always, let's also make sure that we are looking out for one another, because we don't let our mates fight alone.